So do you have to do anything, or has she got it all set up?
I think it's already set up, right?
And this is the point where I watch my like.
Okay. So we have the names.
You see?
Sounds familiar, but was one of the people yesterday.
Yeah. So yesterday. And so on. And.
Yesterday we got 8 participants.
Pretty good.
So
Yeah. Okay, that's great.
I think they're coming.
So. So on. Hello. Hello, everybody.
Hello, everybody.
Yeah. So do you want to just introduce yourself? I mean, I've gotten about them.
Okay,
Yeah, I did.
sure, I'll start then. And I assume that the screens are the way they should be. And so
Angela. Hello, Angela.
well, this is the third day in our session of readings in Buddhist text. I'm John Marston. I'm the visiting professor here at University of Otago, and I'm, as you know, if you've attended the earlier sessions, I'm a professor at the Center for Asian African Studies at El Colegio de Mexico. Where I teach Southeast Asian studies. But over the years, my field of research has primarily been Buddhism in Cambodia. And so today I continue with my research, and my topic today is about Cambodia, the Asia Foundation, and Cambodian monks in India. Like my previous two talks, this is a historical talk, but fairly recent history. The Cambodia and India in the 1950s and 1960s. So this topic, I somehow identified the connection with the Asia Foundation before this book came out, but this is sort of the key book in many ways, by Eugene Ford, Cold War Monks, Buddhism in America's Secret Strategy in Southeast Asia. And he talked about the Asia Foundation, the fact that it was linked, that it was basically a covered organization for the CIA. And its goal was to promote Buddhism as a line of defense against communism. And this was very important in the early history of the Asia Foundation. The Asia Foundation later shifted its focus. So early on, when I began talking about my own research in this, I gave a talk. I'm a professor in Mexico at University of Colima, and the next day or the next week, there was an article in the student newspaper saying CIA supports Cambodian Buddhist monks and in the 1950s. And in a way, I was happy because it sort of dramatized my research. And yet, in a way, that's a distortion of my research because as you'll see that even though the Asia Foundation did ultimately had this agenda of supporting Buddhism in order to fight communism, in some ways, the fact that what I'm going to talk about was ultimately funded by the CIA is a little bit irrelevant. And what I'm interested is in the social phenomenon of this organization, which the fact that the CIA, the CIA wasn't even that well known as an entity, I believe, at this time. It became better known over the course of the 50s and 1960s. But the people who worked for the Asia Foundation, the people who received funding from the Asia Foundation, didn't really know about the CIA link. But they did know it was an American foundation, and they did know that the Americans were opposed to communism. And so in a way, that was enough to know for them. And maybe it's enough to know for us. And what I would stress is that the kind of things I'm talking about were not completely bad. That I'm talking about scholarships that were given to Cambodian monks to go to India in the 1950s and 1960s. And that one may say that these were in some ways a good thing, but it was a complex thing. And so what I'd like to talk about here is some of the social complexity of what that meant at the time. My overall research and my current research, well, if you attended the first session, I talked about a Cambodian monk named Dhammachai Mahatera. Cambodians often called him by his name before he became a monk, Belong. For quite some time now, I've been interested in Cambodian monks who studied in India in the 1950s and 1960s. I've now identified like about 35 names, and there are various reasons I was attracted to this topic. And now two of these monks are quite famous. And while my original goal was to look at all of them, and some of the chapters of the book I'm working on will look at all of them or look at it more generally, my research has tended to focus on two monks who are particularly famous. One of them was Dhammachai Mahatera, who I talked about on Monday, and the other one is a monk named Mahagosananda. Now, for today's talk is based on a publication, but a publication that appeared only in Spanish so far. But it really draws on, so what I'm primarily going to present is this, is the material in this article that was published in Spanish, which I originally wrote in English, but was translated into Spanish for the publication. And I hope someday it will be published in English. But I'm drawing on as well another publication, which was in the reading packet about Navanalanda Mahavihara, which was an institute started in the 1950s in India, which was one where Mahagosananda attended, and where a lot of monks from a number of Buddhist countries attended, and had some special importance at that time. And I'm also drawing, as you will see, that Mahagosananda figures in my paper, but in a fairly minor way. So, but I thought we might start by just talking a little bit about Mahagosananda and who he is, and before starting the paper proper. And so these are, Mahagosananda was one of three monks who went from Cambodia to India in the 1950s, about the time of Cambodian independence. And they studied originally at Navanalanda Mahavihara, this school that had only recently opened. And here is, I believe he's on the figure of the right of the three monks. On the left-hand picture, there's a picture of him in his later life in the center picture. And then just to think of his significance, that when I started my research, I was fascinated with Mahagosananda, and I had remembered when he was still alive and when he did peace walks in Cambodia, and he always seemed significant to me. But at that time, I believed his importance in Cambodia was disappearing. It seemed like Cambodians I talked to remembered him less and less. And when I started my research, I think that was the case. Although now when I talk to younger Cambodian monks, there seems to be renewed interest in Mahago Sananda as someone who represents he's a historical figure who represents what is most positive about the Cambodian monkhood, I believe, at this time. And so he's a figure, a recent historical figure who nevertheless has a certain prominence in the history of the recent history of the Cambodian monkhood, who may become more important as time goes by. He, in a paper, in a draft chapter which I wrote, I talk about his early background, his background in Cambodia, his family life, what little we know about it, how he studied it, how he was resident of Wat Ulam. He was there actually during World War II at a time when U.S. bombs hit the temple, which is in itself a significant moment. So I talk about his intellectual influences, which are part of what we'll be considering here, including his time at this school, Nava Nalanda Mahavihara, which some of that, the intellectual life of that, will come out when we talk about the Asia Foundation and its policies toward Nava Nalanda Mahavihara. He was also at that time, he was in India at the time that Ambedkar was an important figure in Buddhist history in India. He was a Dalit. He was from what used to be called an untouchable caste, and yet he became one of the most important political figures at the time of Indian independence. And near the end of his life, he converted to Buddhism, and there was mass conversion to Buddhism among the lower caste people at that time. And this influenced the intellectual climate that then influenced Mahago Sananda. He was influenced as well by a Japanese monk, Nichidatsu Fuji, who promoted peace movements in worldwide, but especially in India and Japan. He created a peace stupa in Rajagir, which was close to where Mahago Sananda was living. And by all accounts, Mahago Sananda had a connection to this Mahayana Buddhist movement in the Nichiren Buddhist tradition, which seemed very different than his training as a Theravada Buddhist monk. And then when he left India, instead of going back to Cambodia, he spent time in a Thai forest tradition monastery, which we see in this picture. This is an entry picture because he's with two rather well-known Western meditation teachers. Jack Cornfield and Christopher Titmuss are in this picture. This picture was posted on Jack Cornfield's website. And he was studying with Achan Damadaro in the south of Thailand. And so he spent quite a long period of time from the mid-70s until the early 80s at a meditation wat in southern Thailand. So just to give you an idea that who Mahago Sananda was, because among other things, my research into this topic of the Asia Foundation and its sponsorship of Cambodian monks, it started out with my interest in trying to understand Mahago Sananda. And so I will in the course of my paper, I'll be talking more about Nava Nalanda Mahavihara. What at that time it was informally called Nalanda University, and now there's another Nalanda University. And this is something I have published about. But I think I will just. Oh, and here's a picture of Mahagosananda in the early 90s. He led a series of peace walks. The first one was from the border areas of the refugee camps and border camps, and he took a group of monks and nuns and layperson who performed a peace walk from the border to Phnom Penh. And over several years, he led several peace walks of this kind. And this is what he's perhaps most famous, which he's most famous for. Although he has other reasons for having significance as well. So just jumping forward in my PowerPoint, because, and as I go further in my talk, we'll be talking more about how Navanalanda Mahavihara was a bit controversial, but to introduce this idea at the very beginning, and Navanalanda Mahavihara was formed in the early 50s by a monk he's an Indian monk. His name is, I always pronounce it wrong, Jagadish Kashyapa. I used to say Jagdish Kashyapa. Now I'm told I've been pronouncing it wrong all this time. And Jagadish Kashyapa was Indian and from I believe from Bihar state in India. He, for various reasons, he got interested in Theravada Buddhism. He ordained as a monk in Sri Lanka, and then he came back to India, and he was an important Buddhist scholar, and he was. Later on, I'll talk about some of the things he did, which were questioned by the Asia Foundation. But perhaps now when people look back at him, and this relates to some things we were talking about yesterday, that his perhaps premier achievement was that, and he ended up retiring as the he founded this Navanalanda Mahavihara, and then he later on left for a period of time to work on his edition of the Pali of the Tripitaka, a 40-volume edition of the Tripitaka in Devanagari script, and actually this was the first time there was a complete edition of the Tripitaka in Devanagari script, which is, if you go to Navanalanda Mahavihara, they say, this was a major achievement, and they say they talk about it as perhaps as one of the most important editions of the Tripitaka, which has since been expanded into even an edition with more annotation and even more volumes. Just to note in this picture as well, the architecture. The architecture was when this university was built in the 1950s. It was very modern. You can see it has this kind of claim to modernity. At the same time, there are all these motifs of stupa architecture, which was a kind of Buddhist modernity, let's say, of its time, which and in this picture on the right, you see he had a collection of Buddhist manuscripts from all over the world, from China, Burma, Cambodia, and when I recently visited the university for the second time, and was able to visit this manuscript room, which they were very proud of, and all these manuscripts were collected by Jagadish Kashyap while he was alive, but probably in the 1950s and 1960s. And so, just as an indulgence, because I was trying to see if I could, this was when I visited there recently, a Cambodian student who's studying there took this little video of me And this doesn't particularly relate to my research, but I'll play this video partly because I was trying to figure out how to put this, download this video, and Elizabeth very kindly helped me. And so let's just play it. And this is the librarian talking about, oh,
You don't have sound.
I guess I don't have sound. So
That's
anyway, so much for that. But
But you can see, it's palm leaf.
it's actually not palm leaf,
It's
but most of, yeah, they had palm leaf manuscript, but this was exceptional. It was that banana, there were slices of banana stem, thinly sliced, and there was a Cambodian manuscript. They had
Banana
various types
stem.
of manuscript there.
Wow.
Anyway, this, just to give you an idea of what
Family.
Navanalanda Mahavihara represented and represents at the present time, it's still, there are other universities in India that have Buddhist studies, and this one has its own peculiarities and is very text oriented. It's possible that some of you might find it helpful to go there and consult their collection at some point. So, okay, but let's go back, and if I can figure out how to go back. And well, one more thing that relates to this series of talks as a whole is that, and as I said in the first two talks, that I don't consider myself particularly a textual scholar, and yet each of these talks will have some key texts. And so in this case, those of you who have the readings packet, and will notice at the end there is a letter written by a Cambodian student who had negative experiences with the Asia Foundation, as you'll see. And he originally wrote his letter in Khmer as sort of as a protest rather than writing the letter in English. And the letter was for some reason translated into French. So what we have is a French letter, which then I've translated in passages into English. And so keep in mind that if our goal in this lecture series is to look at Buddhist texts, then in this research which I'm doing is largely drawn on archives from the Asia Foundation, which is at Stanford University and the Hoover Institute. And most of these are rather dry memos, although it's amazing how often these little dry memos have little bits of drama in them, which is what I'm attracted to. This letter by the student somehow was at another level. It seemed to be very personal and yet relate to some of the larger issues of Buddhism in relationship to politics and culture that I'm concerned here. So keep in mind that as I go through my paper, that perhaps this letter at the end will be sort of the culmination of this. And so I do think this is ultimately a paper relating to issues of text. So so as I say, and here I begin my paper proper. And just to say what I said before, we start with thinking about the fact that the Asia Foundation did have this connection to the U.S. government and was funded by the CIA. And its ultimate goal was to shore up the religion as a bulwark against communism. In practice, this meant funding projects intended to consolidate Buddhist institutions at local and regional levels. This was development aid that these institutions saw as serving their own goals. The kind of things the Asia Foundation were not particularly sinister. Among other things, it worked to strengthen international Buddhist networks, such as through the growth of the World Fellowship of Buddhists. These Asia Foundation activities were not precisely secret, even though the direct connection to the US government was. By using the Asia Foundation, the US avoided the appearance of direct involvement in the religious affairs of other countries. Many Asia Foundation employees, and we assume most of its funding recipients, were unaware of a CIA link. But my focus here is on a small window into this process. The Asia Foundation funding of Cambodian monks studying in India. As I say, my purpose is not to unmask a sinister plot, but to look at what it meant in human terms for the monks involved. These were border crossers making their way at the intersection of various political and cultural worlds, and how this contributes to our understanding of the history of Cambodian Buddhism. Again, as in my first talk, there is a Cold War dimension to all of this, but I'd admit that it's a subtle one. The Asia Foundation that emerges from the study is not a unified front. It groped sometimes in inconsistent ways in its attempt to deal with culture and politics. If what I describe is informed by a discourse of Cold War Buddhism, or a set of such discourses, and is shaped by larger relations of power, we must also recognize a constant give and take as it was put into practice. So this again relates to my first talk, in that what I'm interested in is looking at individual players, individual people, as they're sort of negotiating their way in relationship to these larger processes, which we can associate with the Cold War and with other Buddhist movements. We're talking about approximately 15 monks going to India in the period from 1956 to 1965. More Cambodian monks went later. They were funded initially through the two principal Cambodian Buddhist associations, and then in the early 60s were scholarships given by the Asia Foundation. While my research emphasized monks going to India, the number involved increases if we include Asia Foundation funding of Cambodian monks going to Thailand, Sri Lanka, and Burma in the same period. For example, in 1959, the Asia Foundation was funding 12 Cambodian student monks, only 5 of them in India. A 1961 list had 9 Asia Foundation funded monks in India, 2 in Sri Lanka, and none in Thailand or Burma. Scholarships to Thailand were important in the early days. In a 1954 accord for clerical education between Thailand, Laos, and Cambodia preceded the period of Asia Foundation funding. Sending Cambodian monks to Thailand ended early in November 1958, however, because of diplomatic tensions between the two countries. Cambodian monks returned at that time. In a 1959 report, Richard Gard recommended ending scholarships to Burma because, he wrote, its education system for monks was so similar to what was available in Phnom Penh and Bangkok. And this recommendation was apparently implemented. The number of scholarships to Sri Lanka remained small. Some monks who went to other countries would then go for further education in India. India was in any case always considered the most appropriate destination for studies beyond the bachelor's level. There were also significant numbers of student monks from Thailand and Laos going to India in this period. And this is something that I would love to see other people do research on. Some were funded by the Asia Foundation. I do not have precise data on this. I think as I've talked to people that there was the percentage who were funded by the Asia Foundation was perhaps smaller than in Cambodia. As I said, my larger project centers on 2 Cambodian monks who were also in India at this time, Dharmavara Mahatera and Mahagosananda. Although Dharmavara was peripheral to what I discuss here, he was already well established in India when the student monks came. He would have been well known to the younger monks who sometimes stayed at his temple on the outskirts of Delhi. Mahagosananda did receive some Asia Foundation funding early in his studies in India, although the Cambodia Pali Association, through the Cambodia Pali Association. But he figures in our narrative not so much for the funding he received as for the fact that it was later denied. Consequently, most of his time in India was with Government of India scholarships. It is significant in any case to see him as a contemporary of the monks with Asia Foundation funding. They would have known each other, and they all, together with Dharmavara, participated in a historical moment in which a new internalization of Buddhism flourished, while several Buddhist countries, including Cambodia, celebrated the greater cultural sovereignty their recent independence would represent. The student monks we are interested would have to come to have varying degrees of name recognition, Cambodians, in the period from 1960s to the 1980s. What we're talking about is not just monks, but also men who, after leaving the monkhood, maintained ties to each other and Cambodian Buddhist institutions. Chim Pon, maybe we can go back to this picture. Chim Pon and Mi John, eventually after leaving the monkhood, became announcers for Voice of America, which, given the importance Voice of America was to have in Cambodia, represented a kind of celebrity. Based in Washington, D.C., and on the board of the Cambodian Temple in D.C. area, they were instrumental in bringing to the U.S. a monk who had also studied in India with Asia Foundation funding, Ung Mien, then pursuing a doctorate in Great Britain. Ung Mien would turn the temple in Silver Springs, Maryland, into one of the most prominent Cambodian temples in the United States, and was well known to Cambodians throughout the U.S. in the 1980s. As part of the funding agreement, many scholarship recipients were signed documents committing to teach at the Buddhist University on returning to Cambodia, and some remained as faculty there permanently, either as monks or laymen. Tao An, who remained in the monkhood, was considered the best Cambodian Sanskrit of his generation. Gong Ku became the director of the Buddhist Lycée. Some as laymen went on to teach at the Phnom Penh University. Lee Kim Long, who completed a doctorate in India, became a dean there. His master's thesis on Angkorian architecture was published as a book by Banaras Hindu University. Hu Lang taught at the Buddhist University and completed a master's degree in the US. He published books in Khmer in the 1970s, a series of short volumes on civics and political science. And after a few months as the Deputy Secretary of State, a book about corruption in the Ministry of Education, which was banned in 1974. Returnees from India would have been among the best speakers of English in Cambodia in the 1960s. And promoting English was another of the Asia Foundation's stated goals. Under the name of Committee for Free Asia, the Asia Foundation began working in Burma in 1952, where it developed good relations with UNU and then extended to Sri Lanka and Thailand in 1954. At the time, it began calling itself the Asia Foundation. Robert Bloom, the Asia Foundation president, came to Cambodia to arrange setting up an office in November 1954, and its director arrived in March 1955. The country had just become independent. It would open an office in Laos in 1959. The Asia Foundation director in Cambodia, Leonard Overton, a World War II veteran and a 1949 graduate of Trinity College in Connecticut, had gone to Laos with the State Department's Office of Information Education Exchange. By 1951-52, he was in Phnom Penh, arguably probably with the same agency, and taught English at Wat Unalam. One reason he was perhaps in tune to the Cambodian monkhood. By the early 1960s, according to the oral history interview of a U.S. diplomat stationed in Cambodia, Overton, in his Asia Foundation role, knew everyone and was on good terms with Sihanouk. Sihanouk, who at that time was the head of state. He had abdicated as king. Cambodia, after independence, very quickly assumed a position of neutrality, as we saw on Monday, espousing principles enunciated by Nehru and the position taken by the Bandung conference which Sihanouk and actually Dharmavara Mahathir attended. It was open to US aid in the 1950s, although it tried to counterbalance US aid with aid from communist bloc countries. Sihanouk likewise tried to balance trips to US allied countries with trips to countries in the socialist bloc. His flirtation with the socialist countries and, for example, Cambodia's diplomatic recognition of China in 1958 made the United States nervous. The Asia Foundation was still confident in the 1950s that Sihanouk was not moving in the direction of communism, but played a delicate role in the country. Overton quoted in an Asia Foundation monthly report in 1956 showed his sensitivity to the nuances of Sihanouk's position. The creation of the Asia Foundation Cambodia corresponded to and correlates with US diplomatic measures and with United States Information Service invitation to key Buddhist figures to visit the United States. These were not Asia Foundation trips, but there was coordination with the Asia Foundation in organizing the trips, such as giving the Asia Foundation responsibility for entertaining guests when they were in San Francisco near the Asia Foundation headquarters. As we saw on Monday, Dharmavara Mahathir was the first to go to the United States in 1955 and 1956. More significant for the scholarship program was a trip the following year by Pol Pot, the second Reiki Mahanikai monk and inspector of Cambodian monastic education, who we've also talked about. He had already the previous year received Asia Foundation funding to visit Buddhist educational institutions in Thailand. Monk scholarships were selected by an independent Cambodian commission, which did not include Hu Tat or the Mahanikai Patriarch Junat. But it's clear from Asia Foundation memos that they had much interaction with him on the scholarships over the years. In 1957, Sam Nyen, president of the World Federation of Buddhist Cambodia, and who was the father of Sam Sari, an important Cambodian political figure, made a similar USIS, U.S. Information Service sponsored trip to the United States. He was described in memos as a good friend of the Asia Foundation. The Asia Foundation began giving support early on to the two largest lay Buddhist organizations, Association des Amis de l'École de Pali, called in English the Cambodian Pali Association. It later preferred the name Mit Bhutika Vidyalai, or Friends of the Buddhist Lycée, and the Cambodian chapter of the World Fellowship of Buddhists. The Cambodian Pali Association dates to 1949, and the Cambodian chapter of the World Fellowship of Buddhists in 1952, when Malasekari visited Cambodia. So both were new organizations at this time, and in contrast to the historical importance of lay organizations in Burma and Sri Lanka, the very concept of a lay Buddhist association was new to Cambodia. Initial support for the two organizations was for publication and the purchase of office equipment. Both associations listed among their principal goals from the beginning the support of Cambodian monks going to study in foreign countries. This related in part to the plans for the creation of a Buddhist university, which was still in planning stages when the Asia Foundation first came to Cambodia. The monks chosen were former students of the Buddhist Lycée and later the Buddhist University. Like most Cambodian monks, they typically had rural backgrounds. Almost all had been residents at Wat Unolam or Wat Lanka during studies in Phnom Penh. The first group of monks sent to India by the Friends of the Pali Association in 1956 were the monks we see in this picture. Mahagosananda, who was known then by his name Ba Yao, Miechan, who would later be a Voice of America announcer, and Suan. They all went to study at Nalanda. A group of Cambodian monks and nuns had gone to Burma for study in 1954 in conjunction with a 2-year process leading to the Sixth Buddhist Council. Others were in Thailand. We know that when the Asia Foundation began supporting Cambodian monks through the World Fellowship of Buddhist Cambodia, they contributed to support for monks already resident in Sri Lanka, Burma, and India. We don't know the exact circumstance which brought the monks there. Although the Asia Foundation had several projects in India, the Indian government resisted giving permission to set up there. For several years until 1961, scholarship funding was administered through the Cambodian embassy. The opening up of Asia Foundation offices in India gave the Asia Foundation more capacity to check on recipients or on occasion administer its own scholarships without going through organizations. So my talk is divided into three sections. First is what the documentary evidence shows about how the Asia Foundation thought about its own project of sending Cambodian monks to India. The second part will be about the degree which we find evidence of Cold War anti-communism in these documents. And the third part, which is most cultural, is about the Asia Foundation response to Cambodian monks in India who chose to leave the monkhood, and how this became more complicated than one might expect. Oh, okay, and I'm behind in my, here are publications of the two Cambodian lay organizations that initially the Asia Foundation gave money to these organizations, who in turn used this money to fund Cambodian monks studying in India. Later on, some Asia Foundation money was given directly to the monks.
We also bought printing presses
Right,
and paper.
yeah, they were funding various things for this organization. Here's just an example of a letterhead from the Asia Foundation. This is the kind, in my own research, I was dealing with in the archives at Stanford University with this kind of memo. The Asia Foundation files on the student monks tend to be about kinds of things the administration of any scholarship fund would focus on. Contracts with recipients, the logistics of providing funds and addressing crises when funds did not arrive or appeared insufficient, and attempts to monitor the academic performance of recipients. Over the years 1955 to 65, we see repeated commentary on the program of scholarship for monks, often in reports by Richard Gard, a scholarship of Buddhism based at Yale, who was a consultant to the Asia Foundation for the years 1956 to 1963. And here is, I believe the picture on the left is Richard Overton, and the pictures on the right are both pictures of Richard Gard.
Oh, that's Everton on the left.
Yes. And Gard, by the way, is an important figure in the book by Eugene Ford, which I showed at the beginning of the talk. These reports and memos underline for us the degree of internal debate about what the scholarship meant and whether they should be continued. As early as 1956, before the Asia Foundation began funding scholarships, we see Gard writing about the need for monks to study outside Cambodia. The training of Buddhist teachers for the Université Bouddhique and therefore for the Lycée Bouddhique and in turn the Buddhist primary schools is a fundamental need deserving the Foundation's further consideration. They cannot be very well trained in Cambodia, and the possibility exists that the Chinese communists and other communists may offer to train them in modern secular subjects elsewhere. For in spite of wishful thinking by some Americans, the Chinese and Russian communists have not abandoned serious studies of Buddhist doctrines and practice for ideological exploitation. So you can see that the motivation was from the beginning competition with the Chinese and the Russians, but there was also motivation to anticipation of the creation of a Buddhist university. and the need to have Cambodian monks who were trained and able to teach at the Buddhist university. Although Gard saw the need for Cambodian monks to study outside of Cambodia, he never warmed to the idea of them studying in India. He felt that Sri Lanka could potentially become a good destination. He hoped that Cambodian monastics would eventually have a level of training where they could study in Japan. The prospect of Cambodian monks studying in the US was also weighed, although he was skeptical that any would be qualified academically in the near future. The Asia Foundation was aware of the limitations of their agreements with the two Cambodian lay Buddhist organizations. We find some grumbling about the way the arrangements work. Their contributions were intended to be only part of the financial support students received. In the case of the Cambodian Poly Association, when they tried to limit their contribution only to students whose academic performance they felt merited support, the association used its portion of the contribution to continue supporting students the Asia Foundation did not feel deserved it. In the case of the World Fellowship of Buddhist Cambodia, tended to let the Asia Foundation assume the burden of scholarship support so it could use its own money for a building fund. All this was no doubt a factor when in the early 1960s, the Asia Foundation began experimenting with funding monks directly, which it previously funded through the two organizations. There's mention in memos of World Fellowship of Buddhist Cambodia protesting this. The Asia Foundation also began funding some newer scholarships recipients directly. But they never stopped supporting some students through the two organizations. Richard Gard tended to be a harsh critic, however, his advice was often ignored. He's perceivtive, if unsympathetic in his description of what the scholarships may have meant to the monks involved. The desire and need for study abroad by Buddhist monks should not be confused by either Sangha or Foundation for the desire, need, and program for increased intra-Asian Buddhist relations through conferences and certain visitations. Historically, Buddhist monks are wanderers and international travelers. The present-day Buddhist student monk feels himself a part of this tradition and is attracted by international events, by the example of increasing air travel by laymen and by the opportunities now afforded him by friendly foreign organizations, whether the Asia Foundation or the Peking government. Consequently, I suspect that the desired, and here is where the quote appears on the screen, I suspect that the expressed desire and need for study abroad by monks applying to the Foundation for assistance is often actually an urge to travel. After the bhikkhus have seen the outside world, which is customarily denied to them at home, they find it difficult to return to the monastic life when they come back. Hence, my real question is how much educational accomplishment for the Sangha to serve itself in lay society is the Foundation effecting through present travel scholarship grants to the Theravada monks? The program cannot be justified upon the grounds that study abroad at least broaden the perspective of the student monk, fosters better intra-Asian Buddhist relations and understanding, or that not all is lost even if the monk returns to lay life afterwards. These side benefits can be achieved more directly and economically through other programs, such as intra-Asian Buddhist conferences. Gard's position in general was that instead of study abroad, monks could be better trained by increased cooperation with secular educational institutions in their own countries. International connections could be better promoted by participation in international seminars and conferences than by foreign schooling. The Asia Foundation, however, chose not to follow his suggestions. One memo says, I quote, even if the measures suggested by Dick Gard are put into effect, there will still be a lack of educated, trained leadership in the Cambodian Sangha. Admitting the force of Gard's criticism, training abroad is still a necessary expedient to make possible the further development of Buddhist education in Cambodia. The Asia Foundation was aware of the problematic of having Buddhist monks study in India, primarily a Hindu country. Gard wrote in another report, most Indian scholars of Buddhism are Hindu in belief and approach with a consequent non-Buddhist understanding of Buddhism. In my opinion, they are not qualified to teach Buddhist monks about Buddhism, but would be helpful in guiding research on the doctrinal and historical relations between Buddhism and Hinduism. For those Buddhist monks already well advanced in both Buddhist studies and modern critical methods of analysis. I doubt whether Buddhist and Hindu studies are well correlated in Indian education. And this perspective, and thus prospective teachers at the Université de Boutique need most in addition to training in modern scholarships. These are issues that continue to form the situation of Cambodian monks studying in India now. But despite all this, the scholarship program continued. A 1962 memo by Leonard Overton to the Asia Foundation representative is also revealing. He seems to be responding with some frustration to a complaint by the Asia Foundation office in India about the caliber of a candidate they were proposing for studying in India. He states the first Cambodian monks who finished studies in India were already making a positive contribution in Cambodia. But in other ways, he's defensive. And I'll read the longer quotation, which we see the last part on the screen. Quote, however, the question of abilities qualification set will undoubtedly present itself again next year, when we will submit the names of another group of student monks. We'll certainly attempt to get the best candidates that we can. This is the basis of our entire scholarship program. However, we have no illusions that next year's crop will be substantially better than this year's. The candidates we selected this year were all in the top half of their class at the university, the most advanced Buddhist educational institution in the land. Of course, the problem is that even these students are seldom top flight in our Western terms of reference. They are merely the best available. And to be perfectly frank, the only reason that we have sent and will continue to send monks to India for study is that it is about the only country where they can get into a university and complete a degree program. While the standards in India are higher than here, they're still generally low. This is why we are not as certain as you that Nyet Un is, quote, virtually incapable of obtaining a degree. Others in the past with only slightly better records here have done so. And when I read this, I want to emphasize that I'm not approving of what he's saying, that there's a condescension here, that this is an American who feels confident in the superiority of himself and his educational system. And in fact, on the ground, we see something more complicated. And Cambodian monks studying in India were able in many contexts to get a good education. And many of them were, in the context of their own background, very qualified, as we see in their later careers in Cambodia. So this seems like a place to take a break. Should we take a short break now? Does anyone want to start to make comments now before we take a break?
So I'm just curious, like, is this racism or just superiority, do you think? Sorry, we're having a racism discussion this morning, so it's on my mind.
Well, I think there is some racism there, but it's also true that I mean, it is true that India is a Hindu country, not a Buddhist country.
Yeah.
And I do think, and Gard was arguing that they would be better off in Sri Lanka, and I
Okay.
think that probably was true.
So
on the other-
pro Sri Lanka.
Gard was pro Sri Lanka,
Okay, that's
although
interesting.
he thought maybe not right away, but eventually. And it's also true that the Cambodian monastic education system was still weak at this point.
It was a high school. It was a
It-
Poly High School. They
Right,
called it the
yes,
Poly High
yeah.
School. So the Buddhist, when is it Buddhist University
So the
started?
Buddhist universities opened at about this time.
Okay.
I think by the end of the 50s, the Buddhist university had started. But the first monks came, like Mahagosananda, were going to India when there was no Buddhist university. And so when they came back, they were among the first professors at the Buddhist university. And so there is a grain of truth here. At the same time, clearly, Overton and Guard would say the best place to study Buddhism would be the United States, which is probably not the case. And there's a certain attitude which was condescending toward Asian institutions, and that perhaps did not recognize that the scholarly traditions that really did exist in India at that time, which may have oriented themselves in different ways than, say, a program in Buddhist studies would have oriented in the United States. Some of these monks really were not successful. They barely, some of them I think did not pass their courses. The Cambodian monks who were studying in India at the beginning, I think at least some of them did not do that well in the university, although some of them did. Some of them would go on to be among the most important Buddhist scholars in Cambodia of their time. So,
Thank you.
So did they use English?
yes, they did do
They
English.
had to do everything in English.
Yeah, they were studying in English. And so,
So
among other things, actually, this is part of the goal of the Asia Foundation, that these students would come back and would speak English. And so, among other things, like some of them left the monkhood and became English professors of English or translators of English. And in Cambodia, which was at that time, it had a background of French colonialism. So English was not widely spoken in Cambodia at this time. So the monks who studied English, who studied in India, when they came back, they were among the best speakers of English in Cambodia.
mm,
Yeah.
I think there's a
Pardon?
question, I think.
Oh,
This
is
is-
someone,
Raise the hand.
Oh,
This
this
is
is- Some.
okay.
Yeah. I got a question if you don't mind.
Yes.
I find it a very interesting when I read the text. It so much information, and thank you so much. My question is I was wondering how the Asia Foundation, because their work is to support the Buddhist monk to get education in India, but to me, I find it. I think that they sound more negative or pessimistic toward the Khmer Buddhist monk. I don't know. Maybe it's just a feeling. Do you know the reason why?
Well, I think there is, whether we want to call it racism or colonialism, there was that element, and they had, as we know, their main goal was really fighting communism, but they decided that one way of fighting communism was to make Buddhism stronger, and so I think from the perspective of Buddhists, we can say they did some positive things in helping to build up Cambodian Buddhism and international Buddhist organization like World Fellowship of Buddhists at this time. At the same time, we do see this condescension, and which is which can be kind of irritating. And you should be critical of that. But that's part of the whole, well,
The time. The
The-
time,
at the
Because-
time of the time. I mean, this was,
post-World War
it
II.
was post-World War II, it was post-colonial. I mean, the United States was did not colonize Cambodia, but the United States, in its role and relationship to the countries of Asia, had something of what we could call a colonial mentality. And we still see these attitudes, which I think it's correct to call colonial attitudes.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, well, let's just take a 5-minute break then.
There's a number of scholars. If you're interested in this, the Asia Foundation, there's a number of scholars that are working on that right now. They were active in Tibet and they're active in the Philippines. So there's like, you can find scholars that are working on the Asia Foundation and the Philippines and Tibet. And they, obviously they were very worked up about Japan in the aftermath of World War II. Yeah. So that book by Ford is pretty cool. So the first World Fellowship of Buddhists inaugural conference happened in Colombo and Kandy. The second one happened in Hiroshima. So that was a signal to the Asia Foundation that they had to be there and make sure Japanese weren't rising from the ashes, you know. So they filmed the whole thing. So it was a black and white film of this WP conference in Hiroshima. So fascinating, yeah. With the sort of American guys looking like CIA agents walking around going, what's going on, what's going on? The Japanese are gonna make trouble, we know it. And of course, the Buddhists were trying to emphasize peace. You know, neutrality and the tragedy of Hiroshima. Yeah, the Americans are going, we won. The Japanese are going, where's the compassion, where's the metta? I'm trying to forget about World War II. Crazy. I mean, yeah, can't forget about the context, historical context when you're doing this stuff. Yeah.
Did their influence in Tibet, that must have like drained a little bit?
Well, they supported the freedom fighters in Tibet. They were freedom fighters fighting the Chinese, and obviously they lost. And they end up in refugee camps in India. And there's been some research on these former freedom fighters and their role. Yeah, somebody's read a thesis on, like, she went around and interviewed these former freedom fighters and how they were progressively distanced from the Dalai Lama with the attempt to westernize the Dalai Lama and make it possible to, it's sort of the soft culture thing to the Western world. So they're trying to isolate these former freedom fighters, and they don't have any money and they don't have any influence. But this woman went in and got all the stories about how they got funding and weapons from shoot the Chinese, and you know, so it gives you insight into what's happening in the Ukraine, for example. God help, God, you know, these things are just, you know, there's constant interference, political interference, and religious activities. Buddhism, I mean, you think Buddhism, that's not political, well. And yeah,
Any kind of funding has some kind of.
Yeah.
It's not like.
nothing's
No.
free.
Yeah, exactly. It's not only Asia Foundation, and
No.
it's everywhere.
So I'm not saying they're bad and they're good, I'm just saying. And just this whole thing of giving printing presses to Buddhists and letting them print journals, like that's pretty wild. And these journals are amazing sources, historical sources. We've got, I think when the funding ran out, those journals stopped. So it's like, you know, you have these beautiful journals, color printing, and then they're not going anymore, but they're amazing historical sources. The wider world. That book by Eugene Ford, it's his PhD thesis, and then his book, it's really good. It was a PhD thesis at, where was Ford?
At Yale. He studied with Ben Kiernan, yes.
So it's, but of course, he doesn't have religious studies training. So look what he misses.
Yeah, I think, and Ford, the interesting thing, he did not go into, he did not go into academia. He's working in,
I've heard he's working for the CIA.
yeah.
Yeah.
So,
And you can't get hold of this documents besides his thesis.
What is CIA? It's a question, right?
Central Intelligence Agency of America. So it's like,
spy.
yeah, the spies.
yes, it's basically the US and the primary American intelligence agency for intelligence overseas. And that's why the CIA has, you know, done a lot of things over the years, and some of them have been questionable, and especially in,
Southeast Asia.
well, those of us who are interested in Southeast Asia are very aware of the role of the CIA at the time of the Vietnam War. Now, the CIA has done a lot of things over the years, and some of it is merely collecting information. And in the 60s, the CIA tended to be more interventionist than perhaps it was later. Later on, there was an attempt to curtail the interventional nature of this Central Intelligence Agency. So it's not my purpose to talk about the CIA so much. And when you talk about the CIA, things become very emotional because people often have, especially I teach in Mexico, and so definitely in Mexico, when you mention the CIA, there's this image of Big Brother intervening in the world, and at different historical moments that has been the case, and exactly. But the CIA is dramatic also because there's a lot of movies about spies, and sometimes and novels, spy novels, and sometimes dramatizing them in ways which are more dramatic than the actual fact. And so one reason I like to give this paper is because people pay attention when I mention CIA. And so maybe some people are more interested than they would be otherwise because of the CIA connection. But in the case of, and the case I'm talking about here, it's more nuanced. It's like the Asia Foundation was promoting US American interests. They did want to fight communism. But their role was fairly low key in the case we're talking about here. And as I say, you know, some of these institutions they supported, we might want to support as well. And that's something I wanted to say as well, that we tend to want to say things are bad or good. That if you talk about the CIA, you pick the CIA as really something very bad, or people who are in the United States who are nationalists might see the CIA as something very good. But what I want to suggest here is something in the middle ground, that is not, that shows some of the ambiguities of the situation. That I don't want to say it was something bad or good. I want to say it's something that had a certain social and political complexity. And so that's what I want to say here. Ultimately, what I'm interested in, what did it mean in human terms, the people who were involved? And so what I'm going to talk about now is how the Asia Foundation made some decisions to withdraw from programs. And in the case of this famous Cambodian monk, Mahako Sananda, he had a scholarship and he lost his scholarship because the Asia Foundation decided his university was communist infiltrated, which probably it wasn't. But in his case, he was able to get other kinds of scholarships. So it didn't really make that much difference, perhaps. But these policies had an effect with people on the ground. And that's what I'm interested in, sort of the drama as it played it out for the people involved. So, okay, let's go on. As we've already seen in some of the quotations, that there was a preoccupation with China and the need to create an alternative to China's influence. And this was part of the Asia Foundation's project of education for monks. The Asia Foundation archives also illustrate how political considerations were a factor in decisions about funding for individual monks, so these decisions were not particularly consistent. An intriguing early case is a monk named Chai Pon, one of the first to go to India and one of the few Cambodian monks to study in Calcutta. In the residence hall where he lived in Wat Unalam, Kot 58, Chai Pon is remembered as coming from the Chiba Ampao area across the river from Phnom Penh and as having been at Wat Nirut Ransai prior to coming to Wat Unalam. This was the temple of Venerable So Hai, a scholar monk of the previous generation, who was also abbot of Wat Nirut Ransai, while also staying at Wat Unalam when he taught at the Pali school. Chai Pon was doubtless a protege of So Hai, as was Umian, another monk from Chiba. It's not clear under what circumstances he went to India in November 1952. The date comes right after a Mahabodhi Society organized tour of relics to Cambodia, what we talked about in our first lecture. And the fact that he went to Calcutta may suggest a connection with a Mahabodhi Society there. In 1962, Asia Foundation memo from the Cambodian office of the Asia Foundation to the Indian office wrote, what he did, I don't think I have this one. No, I don't have it. What he did in his first 2 or 3 years there, we do not know, but we do know that by 1958, he had completed 2 years of Chinese language and 3 years of Sanskrit at Visva Bharati China Bhavona, Santin Niketan in Bengal. I'm doubtless pronouncing that incorrectly. While he was under the personal supervision of the director, Tan Tun Chan, a man who has come to our attention as having dubious political leanings. Chai Pon had been a grantee of the foundation since the 1957-58 school year, but his scholarship was discontinued last summer, 1961, for political reasons. So we see an example of a student losing his scholarship for political reasons. A slightly early memo states in more explicit terms that, quote, we discovered that his primary professor had strong communist leanings. Chai Pon had on visits to Cambodia indicated his interest in teaching Sanskrit there, and he transferred to the Calcutta Sanskrit University in 1961. In the late 1950s, he published 2 articles in Kampuchea Sorya, the Buddhist Institute Journal. The memo indicates an openness to reestablishing his scholarship and asked the Asia Foundation India office to interview him and give an opinion. The only further mention of him in the Asia Foundation files is a copy of a letter to him from the Asia Foundation India representatives. So it appears there was no further funding. The memo gives a peek at how student monks passing in and out of favor with the Asia Foundation according to perception of their political position. We know that by the following year, in 1963, he was back in Cambodia, still a monk and teaching English at Wat Unalam, and a World Fellowship Buddhist sponsored program. Eng So Khan was the secretary to the Mahanikat Patriarch in the late 1960s and early 1970s before going to India himself, states that Chai Pon continued to study in India well into the 1960s without ever completing a degree. So the course at Wat Unalam may have been on a temporary visit to Cambodia. Chai Pon remained a monk, but after returning to Cambodia, taught Sanskrit at the Buddhist University until the Pol Pot period. A more far-reaching case has to do with the Asia Foundation position regarding the Nalanda Pali Institute, which, that is say, Nalanda Mahavihara, which I talked about at the beginning of this talk, which is of interest in part because it touched the experience of Mahagosananda in India. The 5 monks that the Asia Foundation supported through the Cambodia Pali Association all began their studies in India at the Nalanda Pali Institute. Nalanda Mahavihara. The institute was founded in 1951 by Jagadish Kashyapa, an Indian Buddhist scholar monk, which studied in Sri Lanka and taught at Banaras Hindu University before creating the school near the archaeological site of ancient Nalanda University. And so here's the slides I showed you earlier. Here's the picture of Nalanda Mahavihara, which I took on one of my trips there, and a picture of Jagadish Kashyapa, who was, by all accounts, a remarkable monk and a remarkable scholar. It attracted students from many countries, many of them Buddhist monks or nuns, we've also been talking about, wrote in a report following the Asia Foundation funded trip to India. It had the advantage of a non-threatening atmosphere where Cambodian monks could get basic skills in English, Hindi, Pali before going on to study elsewhere. The school also had the advantage, no doubt, of being an institution where monks would be among other monks without standing out. A key document seems to be a 1958 memo by Gard to the Asia Foundation representative in Thailand. He was critical of Nalanda on 2 grounds. The first was its academic quality. And I can't remember if I have any of these. Nalanda University is still primarily a library research institute and not a university or even college. The teacher guidance of the student is poor. Training in study and research methods is negligible. And unless the student has had prior training in study disciplines, he mostly wastes his time at Nalanda. The possibility that he might learn something at Nalanda, which he would not in Rangoon, Bangkok, or Phnom Penh, should not be misconstrued as indicating that he will receive a first-rate college education in Nalanda. Again, as we said previously, there was a condescension to this that we would be wise to question. Gard's other criticism, though, which is more, perhaps more of interest to us, and in this paper, is that it had too many connections to China. Southeast Asian Buddhist bhikkhus, among others at Nalanda, are encouraged to do postgraduate work at Peking because of one, Peking offered travel grants, scholarships, special invitations, etc., to the director and probably some other members of Nalanda University as well. Have been to Peking and are sympathetic to its Buddhist propaganda appeals. Thus, Nalanda University becomes a staging point for Southeast Asian bhikkhus eventually en route to Peking for indoctrination, a result of the cultural relations program exchange between Peking and New Delhi. Now, this obviously is very much an American perspective and a perspective of the Asia Foundation suspicion toward communist relations with China. Here's a picture of, and I'm sorry, I don't remember the year this took place. This was, I believe, in the late 50s. It was a time when a group of monks led by Jagadish Kashyap went to China, met with Zhou Enlai. According to what I've been told, that I think they made a point to bring monks from different nationalities. I'm told that one of the monks was a young Cambodian monk, Suan, who was one of the 3 monks who went to Nalanda together with Mahagosananda. So Jagadish Kashyapa did have a relationship with China, and relating the fact that India had relationship with China. And the Asia Foundation construed this, was very suspicious of this. And they began talking about Navadalan Mahara in terms of communist infiltration, which is probably not the case, although it was an institution where people were exploring different ideas, leftist as well as right-wing, and Jagadish Kashyapa was among those who were doing this. And definitely relationship with China were considered positive by Jagadish Kashyap, but were very suspicious to the Asia Foundation. Gard's memo is very carefully worded, but other notes and memos at this time used terminology of, quote, communist infiltration. One said several times, our people in Phnom Penh asked whether the Asia Foundation might support bhikkhus at Nalanda University. In fact, we have at times, but Gard has since learned that this is not wise because of communist infiltration there. Gard, in evaluating Banaras Hindu University, would write, I have heard nothing particularly ideological, worrisome about Banaras Hindu University in contrast to Nalanda University. Nalanda's reputation was explicitly a consideration when Un Sambet, one of the Cambodian Pali Association scholars, requested funding to go on to another university. And I don't think I have these quotations. In view of Gard's G84 on Buddhist scholarships, I doubt if he will approve or endorse Kurt's proposal here. I think Gard will be all the more doubtful about Venerable Un Sambet in view of his studies at Nalanda, which is penetrated by the communists, according to Gard. Again, this memo is a sort of exaggerating what Gard said. This was stated more formally in a menu the following month, which stated, among other things, according to Dick Gard, Nalanda Institute, Bihar University, where Un Sambet studied previously, is penetrated by communists. While the early menu suggested the application would be denied, the Cambodian representative protested, pointing out that the same logic would be implied denying scholarships to other recipients. In this ensuing discussion, a larger question was raised, reflecting Gard's more general misgivings about India as a site for Cambodian monks to study. Quote, Dr. Gard raised the question of whether or not we should send Buddhist students to government institutions in India, which officially still condones communist China, or whether we should utilize instead training centers in Asia Foundation-aided countries. In the end, Un Sambet was given his scholarship, although to Banaras University, which was familiar to the Asia Foundation, instead of Pune University as he requested. The Asia Foundation archives have relatively few references to Mahagosananda, but they document the fact that he, Lichan, and Amsun received Asia Foundation funding through the Cambodian Pali Association from 1956 to 1958. In 1958, his request for continued funding to pursue a doctorate there was turned down for political reasons. This was in the same period that Unsabet's file was being discussed. At the time Mahagosananda's application was being considered, the other two monks who came with him to India were in the process of transferring to Banaras Hindu University. Although Amsuan returned to Cambodia after a family emergency and never returned to India for studies. There is already in November 1958 a reference to the decision not to give further scholarship aid to Mahagosananda, and this quotation is on the screen. New information about the course of studies at the school is contained, for example, in Richard Gard's letter of 20 September 1958 to Harry Pearson, suggests that this is not an appropriate pace for Cambodian monks to be aided. For this reason, we have rejected an application from Butika Vichilai, the Cambodian Poly Association, to assist Bhikkhu Va Yao, whom we've aided in the past to continue for his PhD at Nalanda. The fact that the issue is still being discussed in March suggests internal debate. The March memo goes on into this in more detail in other sources. It's not hostile to Mahagosananda himself. It shows that there had been friendly communication with him and that the possibility had been suggested of his studying elsewhere, including Japan or Yale. It even goes far to suggest we were also talking in terms of having Narada, a Vajraram Temple, Colombo, and Vayao test out Dr. Peltzer's plan for establishing a Buddhist center at Yale. This memo refers to the fact that how the doctoral thesis had to do with comparison between Buddhism and communism. The document did not in any way suggest that Mahagosananda had communist leanings himself, although it was concerned with the possibility that supporting a student working on this topic could have negative repercussions for the Asia Foundation. Three arguments are made. First, that, quote, if the thesis were to be published and distributed in Cambodian contained the references to the onrush of communism, it is conceivable that the Asia Foundation might be criticized for supporting a monk who has concerned himself with political ideas of the relationship of Buddhism and communism. Secondly, there was fear that the government of India might question the appropriateness of the topic. Finally, there's again reference to Gard's critique of Nalanda in the last issue, the key issue, quote, in view of Dr. Gard's strong reservations against Nalanda, we do not believe that we could suddenly reverse our stand on this institution just to accommodate Yao. I spelled Yao wrong. And Mahagosananda was supported by a government of India scholarship for the remainder of his time at Nalanda. By 1959, Gard was aware that Jagadish Kashyapa had left Nalanda and speculated this might have changed the institution's political complexion. The Asia Foundation in the end had no problem. He would later come back and seemed to have continued to be Mahagosananda's thesis advisor. The Asia Foundation then had no problem in contributing to fund monks who'd been at Nalanda once they went to other schools. More Cambodian monks did end up going to India and studying at Nalanda. However, after this time, there was no Asia Foundation funding for monks there. So here I'm going to shift to some things I wrote about in yet another article, and which is not in this article, and in your reading packet I included an article from the Mahabodhi Society Journal about by Jagadish Kashyap, and it's interesting. Also, when I talk to people in India about Jagadish Kashyapa, whether he had any leftist leanings, they'll say no, not at all, and yet he himself had a complex relationship to Marxism. In the article that I included in the reading packet, there is a very abstract level a discussion of the degree to which Marxism and Buddhism had shared concepts, which he makes it sound like he just happened to find this book on Marxism in a bookstore, but we know that there were other Buddhist intellectuals in India at this time who are very much interested in the ways that that Marxism and Buddhism could combine at this time. And Jagdish Kashyap in his early career was affiliated with two other Indian monks who had also ordained in Sri Lanka. One, maybe the most famous of them, was the monk depicted in the center here, named Rahul Sankrityayan, who definitely who did major work in Tibet, brought manuscripts, important manuscripts to Tibet, to India. Eventually leaving the monkhood, and he definitely identified himself as a Marxist. He wrote these bizarre novels which depicted sort of a primitive state of Buddhist socialism. I don't know these works very well, but he was quite an important influence on Indian Buddhism, and he was basically Jagdish Kashyapa's mentor. And so it's a little bit naive to say that Jagdish Kashyap was unaware of issues of the combination of socialism and Buddhism. Another one who was closer to Jagdish's age was named Anand Kausalyanand, who would be, again, a Buddhist thinker who drew heavily on Marxist ideas the rest of his life. He ended up being closely associated with the movement of Dalits who had converted to Buddhism after the death of Ambedkar. And so what I want to say is that these issues was Navanalanda a hotbed of socialism? Well, no, apparently it was not. And yet there was progressive movements there. These were ideas that were in the air in Buddhist thinking. Buddhist thinking in India during these times was very much associated with ideas about the roles of lower caste populations. And so it does seem that Navanalanda Mahavihar was principally a site for an institution was devoted to the textual study, and yet it was not completely divorced from political atmosphere. Later on, in a later period, which really a later period, there were protests. There were many Vietnamese students studying at Nalanda. They protested the No Dengxian's suppression of Buddhism in Vietnam. What do I have? What pictures do I have here? One of the few monks I'm doing research, few former monks I'm doing research on, who's still alive, who I interviewed on my recent trip to India, is named Kale Pama. And Kale Pama would emphasize that he was never a communist himself. Although at the same time he says that, we learned that and this was in a later period in the 60s, he was involved in progressive movements, protest against peasant movement protests in the area around Nalanda. So it was a complex situation. And I think the Asia Foundation was wrong to simply say that Navanalanda Mahavihar was communist infiltrated. I think that was an ignorant characterization of an institution, but which, like any institution, would have a lot of different people involved, some who were more progressive in orientation, some who were more scholarly in orientation. And so we have this situation of the Asia Foundation labeling Navanalanda Mahavihara as communist infiltrated, which was not really fair. And yet, probably like all educational institutions in India, it had its own complexity of political movements and ideas in circulation. Okay, so the last section I'm going to talk about monks choosing to disrobe. And this becomes an interesting issue as well, and more controversial than one might think. And it shows that there were very different conceptions by the Asia Foundation and the Cambodian monks who received scholarships about what was appropriate and inappropriate in terms of the possibility of these scholarship recipients leaving their monastic robes. The Asia Foundation understood that in the Southeast Asian Theravada tradition, there's no shame attached to leaving the monkhood, and memos show an awareness quite early that many monks were likely to disrobe, if not in India upon returning to Cambodia. In the memo quoted above, Gard suggested that international study might increase the likelihood of leaving the monkhood. But probably the incidence of leaving the monk is no greater in the general monastic population. And the India came down to the fact that the funding, by being defined as, quote, for monks, had little categorical flexibility. It did not recognize the inherent influx of this category in actual practice. Monks themselves may have been naive in not perceiving this. It is interesting that in the first case of this happening, the Asia Foundation did not revoke its scholarship. The monk was named Khut Kileng, who went to India in December 1952 to study languages and pursue a bachelor's degree, and was already there in 1956 when the Asia Foundation began funding him through World Fellowship of Buddhists, Cambodia. There may have been more of a personal connection to him than to other monks, since he had studied English with Overton at Wat Unalam in 1951-52 before going to India. A 1959 memo states 2 years after the fact that, quote, Khut Kileng left the robe in May 1957 with the permission of the head of the Mahanikau Order and the World Buddhist Association of Cambodia. He stated in his request that he had difficulty with food, could not mix freely with students and others in India. He would return to Cambodia if permission were not granted. Khut Kileng seems to be making progress in his studies and might be supported through his bachelor's degree, although it is not clear whether he should be aided up to the master's degree stage. The fact that he is not a monk is perhaps not too important, since he has signed a contract to teach in the religious schools. The others may well quit the robe when they return to Cambodia. So it's interesting, in this original case, there was some flexibility toward an early monk, which may have influenced monks later. We know that Khut Kileng was back in Cambodia by November 1961 when he translated into Khmer some of the English sections of the program for the World Fellowship of Buddhist meetings in Phnom Penh, and has identified his teaching at the Buddhist University. During this period, he also published a translation, a short article in the Journal of the Buddhist Institute, Kampuchea Sorya. He later completed a master's degree in education at Ohio University. Another recipient, Ing Mien, had also left the monkhood, and the 1959 memo recommended discontinuation of his scholarship, not so much for this reason as for poor academic progress. But World Fellowship of Buddhists Cambodia kept supporting him with his own funds for time. It was in 1962, 1963 that the issue really came to the fore. Two cases stand out, Chim Pon and Lee Kim Long. And from interviews, we know something of the personal circumstances of them leaving the monkhood. From the Asia Foundation files, we know that Chim Pon's case arose at the same time the Asia Foundation was struggling to put in place a new approach to the scholarships, where the first graduates of the Buddhist University in Cambodia would be sent to India directly by the Asia Foundation without going through the associations. A May 1962 memo stated that, quote, all 5 of the monks expressed a desire to defrock before leaving for India, but the authorities of the university are not in favor of this. Strong pressure will be put on them to remain monks. By July, 4 of the 5 monks had decided not to go to India if it meant remaining as monks. Quote, "We have just been notified by the officials of the Buddhist University that 4 of the 5 monks discussed in CAM 11 will not be going to India to study after all. The reason for such a startling development is that at the last minute, 4 of them refused to accept the scholarship unless they would be permitted to defrock prior to departing Cambodia. The university officials would not go ahead with the scholarship on this basis, and we are in complete agreement with their position. Neither we nor the university is particularly interested in providing scholarship for these young men as individuals. Our joint interest is in raising the standards of the Buddhist education system by offering advanced study to monks who will eventually teach in Buddhist schools." All this occurred only days before the Asia Foundation was confronted with the fact that Chimpon had left the monkhood. Chimpon was one of the Cambodian monks studying in Thailand who returned in 1958 because of diplomatic tensions between the countries. He was selected for Thailand by the Mahanikai Patriarch Chunat and received funding from the Thai government. Studying at Mahachulalongkorn and resident at Wat Benjamapapit. Of the monks in India, he has a special case in that his Asia Foundation was at the request of Hutat, who told them that Chimpon was, quote, "a devoted monk and likely to remain one." He was the first monk to be sponsored by the Asia Foundation directly, not through one of the lay Buddhist organizations. All this changed when, as the story is told by Chimpon's widow and family documents, he was shown a picture of his future wife, Tep Samat, soon after arriving in Calcutta and was, as it were, struck by lightning. She'd come to India with her sister, the wife of a diplomat, to pursue her education. In Delhi, he met her in person, and their common studies created opportunities for them to see each other. Family members recall it as a Tum Tiu romance, and those of you who know Cambodian literature know this is a reference to a Romeo and Juliet-like story, well-known work of Cambodian literature, where a young man still in robes falls in love tragically with a beautiful young woman. Tep Samat's family soon sent her back to Cambodia, perhaps because they were uncomfortable with budding romance. Chimpon remained in India to complete his degree, but after returning to Cambodia, initiated traditional practices whereby one family approaches another to negotiate the marriage. They were married in 1964. His romantic crisis was doubtless a major consideration in his decision to leave the robes. The Asia Foundation learned he had disrobed from the Asia Foundation India representative, and here's where the quotation appears on the screen. Recently, Jim Green visited the 2 Cambodian monks studying at the University of Delhi. Chimpon appears to have adopted protective camouflage with his long, curly hair, blue checked sports shirt, and navy slacks. He's virtually indistinguishable from the other students at Delhi University. Uken has slightly greater facility in English. Probably warned of the foundation visit several days in advance, he wore saffron robes and a crew cut. He was quickly informed that Chimpon had disrobed. Later in the conversation, he stated that he did not take food or drink after noon, which indicates that he is trying to observe the Vinaya rules. 6 weeks later, a letter was sent to Chimpon telling him that his scholarship was revoked. In a later letter to the Asia Foundation, Chimpon makes it clear that he informed Utat and Chunat of his decision to leave the monkhood. "I am not a man without conscience. I made my decision after reflection. Before leaving the robes, I wrote to Venerable Potivang, Hutat, and to the Supreme Patriarch, informing them. It is telling that neither they nor Chimpon perceived any need to inform the Asia Foundation. Chimpon's March 1963 to the Asia Foundation is one of the most intriguing documents. And the Asia Foundation files on monk scholarships, and that is one of the only documents to give any glimpse of what the recipients were actually thinking, as well as showing how monks were not always passive recipients of Asia Foundation bounty. The letter was a response not to the original letter informing Chimpon that his scholarship was revoked, which he claimed to have never received, but to a later exchange when the Asia Foundation denied him his request for airfare to return to Cambodia. The letter was written after his return. The original was in Khmer, but the record in the files is a translation into French, which the Asia Foundation Phnom Penh sent to offices in India. The accompanying Asia Foundation memo calls it, quote, a violent letter and refers to the invective in it. It's in fact unusually confrontative by Cambodian standards and sometimes employ sarcasm. Quote, I never broke my agreement. It's the Asia Foundation which is the author of this rupture. You like to change your mind quickly like children. But it develops this argument carefully and now without logic. One of the main arguments of the letter is that the original contract signed by him and the Asia Foundation made no mention of any requirement that the recipient remain in the monkhood. The requirement the letter argues was in effect added after the fact. He could have mentioned that there was precedent for monks leaving the robes without losing scholarships. The letter affirms that the Asia Foundation categorized leaving the robes unfairly as something negative when it's considered natural in Cambodian society. By making a comparison with US attitudes toward communism, the letter opens up a political dimension, suggesting perhaps that in this area as well, the US had been caught up in the underlying assumptions of its discourse. And here the quotation is on the screen. You persist in always repeating the term defrock in the same way your government does communist. Communist, you should know how to use the term and use it with regard to its application to real human beings, not distorting it or exploiting it as do people in the category of the uneducated. Don't confuse it with the use of defrock in Christianity. For a Christian who conducts himself villainously and is excluded from a religious community is categorized as defrocked. Then he writes in English of a priest who has behaved badly, dismiss him from the priesthood. Within Buddhism in Cambodia, assuming or leaving the robes is a common act, because any individual except a woman can situate himself in religious life, and it is always the case that they remain in that state for a certain number of days or months, or for a whole lifetime without any constraint put on. He goes on to discuss the difficulties of being a monk in a non-Buddhist country, again ending in a provocative Cold War analogy. Quote, a religious studied abroad has serious difficulties. The local community is looked down on, and its religious state looked down on, and finally there is no progress in studies. In a similar situation you would see for yourself. If you, an American, pursued your studies in the Soviet Union, and if you behaved as capitalist in the school or in the Soviet community, how would the Russians perceive you? Would you not be a thorn to the Russians? Finally, what would become of your studies? And so, even though this is a letter about leaving the monkhood, it becomes a letter with political overtones. He then makes a reference to something very current in Cambodia, accusations that the US had supported a regional power lord in his rebellion against Sihanouk, a sign of anti-American sentiments in Cambodia which were beginning to grow, which perhaps gave Chimpon some feelings of justification in opposing the US. Quote, so who's at fault, me or you? Why do you like putting the blame on others? Why do you support one person to kill another? This way of acting doesn't differ from that of your government, which supported the traitorous Dap Chuan in his attempt to destroy Samdat, that is Sihanouk, or our very revered father of independence. He makes it clear that the fact that he is writing in Khmer instead of English is no accident. Quote, previously I wrote to you in English. Why this time do I write in Cambodian? The use of English in our correspondence is meaningless, it is useless. Finally, he makes a reference to Cambodia's historical grandeur. Quote, Angkor Wat was constructed by Cambodian kings, Cambodian builders, and Cambodian finances, not with American aid. The irony is that after all this, Chimpon would end up being an announcer for Voice of America. Upon returning to Cambodia, he established an English language school. However, political relations with the US deteriorated and the Cambodian government orchestrated demonstrations against the US and Great Britain. He found he could not attract students. His fiancée, Tep Samat, had worked at the US Library in Phnom Penh, and was planning to take a Voice of America examination for potential employees. On her encouragement, he took the exam as well. Uncertain of his direction, he returned to India to study at University of Vaisali with the Government of India scholarship. While there, he received word that his Voice of American application was accepted, and he flew to the US from India with his wife in December 1967. He would play a major role in the creation of the first Cambodian Buddhist temple in the US. So this, I think, is the most dramatic case of which reveals the personal situation of Cambodian monks studied in India with Asia Foundation funding, and how there was a cultural divide in the understanding of what this kind of scholarship could even mean. The other case is Lee Kim Long, whose decision to leave the monkhood came soon after interaction with Chimpon, that the Asia Foundation immediately made reference to the earlier run-in. The first reference to Lee Kim's news status at the end of July 1963. Ong Mian brought interesting news. Apparently, Lee Kim Long has joined the Chimpon Brigade and now sports longer hair, neatly pressed trousers, and bleeding mattress sheets. Now what? More formal communication soon followed. As you can imagine, we were more than a little disturbed by the news that Lee Kim Long has apparently joined the rapidly growing Alumni Association of former monks. We immediately contacted the World Fellowship of Buddhists to find out what they knew about all this. The Secretary of the World Fellowship of Buddhists confirmed that they received a letter from Lee Kim Long dated July 7th, stating that the life of a monk in India was too difficult and he desired to defrock on July 22nd. What made us raise our eyebrows was that after receiving this letter from India, they on July 30th still asked us to give him a scholarship. From the memo, it seems clear that Lee Kim Long, much more than Chimpon, would have understood the implications of decisions, since in the aftermath of the Chimpon confrontation, the issue had been discussed with scholarship recipients. Nevertheless, the Asia Foundation proceeded very carefully. Lee Kim Long had a long history of study outside of Cambodia, going to Burma for 3 years, and then to Sri Lanka, where he completed a bachelor's degree with the Asia Foundation funding. At the time he left the roads, he was in an MA program at Banaras Hindu University. Asia Foundation reports make it clear that he was academically one of the most promising of the scholarship recipients. The Asia Foundation's July 20th letter to him inquiring if he had left the monkhood crossed in the mail with a letter from him informing them that he had passed his preliminary examinations. From interviews, we know that Lee Kim Long met and fell in love with an American woman, Barbara Jean Stanford, who was also a student at Banaras Hindu University. Dharmavara Mahathir's granddaughter recalls that everyone was shocked when they arrived together at the Ashoka Mission in Delhi. Dharmavara performed the ceremony removing Lee Kim Long from the monkhood and then officiated over the wedding. Lee Kim Long would stay in India and complete his master's degree and doctorate, returning to Cambodia with his wife. In 1970, he later became a dean of the Faculty of Social Science and Humanities at Phnom Penh University. To conclude, regionally, there was an increasing distrust of the United States in the 1960s. Soon after Ne Win overthrew U Nu in the 1962, he announced that the Asia Foundation, the Ford Foundation, the British Council, and the Fulbright Cultural Exchange Program would no longer be allowed to work in Burma. Cambodia's head of state, Norodom Sihanouk, became increasingly distrustful of the United States. After the assassination of Ngo Dinh Diem in November 1963, he already had reason to suspect that the U.S. aided rebel activities against his own regime. Later that month, he announced he was cutting off U.S. aid. Relations with the U.S. were tumultuous over the next year and a half, and devolved to the point where diplomatic relations were totally broken off. On May 3rd, 1965, Overton transferred to Saigon that year. But the Asia Foundation maintained offices in Phnom Penh even past the date of the break in relations until March 1st, 1966, even though its activities were attenuated. Another slate of monks was slated to go to India in 1965, but the Asia Foundation decided it would not attempt to implement the agreement. One monk, Lai Cree, determined to get his scholarship, flew to India at his own expense and wrote to the Asia Foundation that he was already in India and expected his funding per the terms of his contract. Diplomatic ties between the US and Cambodia were not reestablished until 1969. The Asia Foundation honored their commitment scholarship recipients until the end of their studies, even after the Phnom Penh office was closed. Lai Cree is referred to in 1967 as the last of the scholarship recipients. Even though his scholarship funding ended that year, he was still communicating with the Asia Foundation about return airfare in 1969 and was writing to the Asia Foundation to inform them about progress in his studies until the 1970s. He was still in India when Cambodia fell to the Khmer Rouge in 1975, and among a group of Cambodian ex-monks who would seek refugee status in the United States. Price cites a 1966 article from the Washington Post, which already quoted Sihanouk expressing suspicions that the CIA was working behind the Asia Foundation, evidenced by their remaining in Cambodia despite hostility. The Asia Foundation no longer had offices in Cambodia when in March 1967, its CIA connections were exposed in an article in Ramparts magazine. The following month, a Cambodian French language magazine edited by Sihanouk published an article calling attention to the Asia Foundation CIA links. And this is what you see here. Avaux spontan de la CI Asia Foundation. The article acknowledged that many in Cambodia who had benefited from the Asia Foundation largesse had expressed regret when it was asked to leave the country the previous year, and there were those who had fond memories of Overton as, quote, a true friend of Cambodia and of his successor. John Bannington described as, quote, a charming drunk. It pointed nevertheless to a recent article in the New York Times on indirect links between the Asia Foundation and the CIA. The scholarship program probably did overall strengthen Buddhist education in Cambodia. At the time, the Buddhist University was just beginning. A 1963 Asia Foundation memo refers to the salutary effects of the incorporation into the Buddhist education system of 3 monks who had returned from India, 2 of them Asia Foundation scholarship recipients, probably Miechan and Unsabet. A number of monks and ex-monks I've interviewed recall with fondness their professors at the Buddhist University and the Phnom Penh University who had studied in India. The prestige of studying in India was firmly established, and monks continued to go there in the late 60s and the 70s, perhaps most with Government of India scholarships. Cambodian monks began going for study there again in the early 2000s. Needless to say, if the Asia Foundation's ultimate goal was to create in Cambodian Buddhism a bulwark against the Khmer Rouge, they did not succeed. Lee Kim Long's wife Barbara returned to the US in 1972. He subsequently had a child with another woman. As his security deteriorated in the course of the war, he made the decision to send the baby girl to live with Barbara in the US, perhaps in late 1974. There is no record for him after Phnom Penh fell to the Khmer Rouge. Actually, I've recently been shown copies of, as Cambodia was falling to the Khmer Rouge in 1975, the US State Department memos had said that Barbara had contacted the United States trying to get word about her husband, who had disappeared. Miechan, like Lee Kim Long, by then a lay professor at the Phnom Penh University, perceived the risk of staying in the country in the months before the country fell and made the decision to leave. With the help of his friend Chimpon, he joined the Voice of America as a Khmer language announcer. His reputation as a professor at the Buddhist University and Phnom Penh University added to his prestige as an announcer and then credibility to Voice of American broadcasts. Persons who had studied outside of Cambodia would have been among the most vulnerable in the Khmer Rouge period, and perhaps all Asia Foundation scholarship recipients resident in Cambodia would have died. So Hans Eun originally studied at Nalanda with the Asia Foundation funding through the Cambodian Poly Association. They later supported his master's degree studies at University of Delhi. Upon returning to Cambodia, he taught at the Buddhist University and continued working there after leaving the robes. In June 1968, his picture appears in Le Secum, a French language magazine, as an example of a promising young leader in Sihanouk's mass organization, Secum Rihnium. In the Pol Pot period, he was jailed and eventually killed at the notorious S21 detention center, now known as Tuol Sleng Museum of Genocidal Crime. From his confession, we know that at the time Phnom Penh was evacuated, he went with his family to southern Kandal province. A year later, he was apprehended and imprisoned in S21. Like other prisoners there, he was forced under torture to write confessions, and the confessions were invariably supposed to provide the names of foreign intelligence networks he was supposedly connected to. He provides a list of his supposed connection to CIA, basically a fantasy list, naming pretty much everyone he worked with or had contact with obviously no connection to reality. The interesting thing is there's absolutely no mention of the Asia Foundation, nor, of course, of the fact, which he doubtless did not know, that the Asia Foundation was linked to the CIA. And okay, that's my talk today. And so let's open it up to comments and questions.
I'm just curious. So I've searched the term like Asian Foundation, but the contemporary role is totally different what it was before. So but now I don't know if it's the same organization.
It's a continuity of the organization. It does not have, I feel quite confident that it's no longer funded by the CIA. It's an American foundation, and it's my belief is that it's quite positive, quite well respected, at least in Cambodia. It does very positive, makes positive contributions to with links to other non-governmental organizations, many of them Cambodian non-governmental organizations. They work throughout the world, and it's still an American organization. It still arguably still has comes out of an American perception of the world, American ideas of what should be promoted in the world. Is that your perception from?
So it's more so what you look at is the link between like the support of the organization with the monks, the monastic community in
In the past?
in the past. But I'm not pretty sure if there is that support still exists
I
with the vision of
doubt it. This was an exceptional case in that in American law, I believe that there's supposed to be a separation between government and religious institution. Normally, the US government would not fund religious institutions. And so in this case, it was something of it. This is one of the reasons why it was pretending to be, not just because the CIA has a reputation of the CIA, it was that also that there was this feeling that US government should not be involved in religious activities at all. So I suspect, I might be wrong, that the Asia Foundation at the present time would not be so directly involved in religious organizations, although they might, for example, support an NGO that might have a religious dimension, but they would be supporting them not as a religion, but as for their social service projects. That would be my understanding of their role at the present time. Although I'm not a direct, I'm not totally aware of all the activities at the present time.
Okay, so I just have to say they were also active in Thailand.
Yeah, that's what I'm gonna ask too.
And as I said, the book,
Ford's
yeah,
book
the
was-
book by Eugene Ford is specifically focused on Asia Foundation and activities in Thailand. And so, anyway, what we have through the Ford book is a much more extensive investigation into the role of the Asia Foundation in relationship to Buddhism than what I'm offering here, and specifically in relationship to
Thailand.
Thailand. And a key person in Thailand was Klausner. What is Klausner's? William Klausner, who was very well respected by, he was an American, but had very deep ties to Thailand. And
He was on the committee of the Siam Society,
Okay.
and he hosted us for lunch in, what year was it? 2016, before he died. He gave Eugene Ford his documents.
Yeah.
So he's the reason why Eugene Ford was able to write this book.
So they were active like before also, like with William? I mean, like what?
He was in charge of Thailand. Overton was in charge of Cambodia. Like, they had operatives in each Buddhist country. I forget who
Ah,
was in
okay.
charge of the
Okay.
Philippines. So,
yeah, they
Yeah.
had, there were some countries where they ended their presence, like in Burma, there was a calculated decision which seemed to come to an agreement with the Burmese government. There was not necessarily any hostility there, but a decision was made to no longer continue activities in Burma after the late fifties, for example. And so I don't know for specific countries where they were and where they not. They operated in many countries throughout the world, throughout Asia.
Yeah. What was that? I don't know the original reason why they established.
against
Yes.
communism.
Yes. So it's gonna be seen as like I don't know. It can be called like part of well,
Cold War.
colonization or
Yeah, Cold War colonialization.
yeah.
Yeah, or what you call it, colonialism and neo-colonialism. The US actively promoted its influence in the world in ways that were maybe sometimes positive and many times not so positive.
And you look at Sarat Tanarat, you know, the prime minister of Thailand, and was it 56, 57? He was afraid of communism getting a foothold.
Mm,
So he would have welcomed support
okay.
from this organization to strengthen Buddhism, to protect from communism. Because, you know, Laos fell,
Yeah.
Vietnam fell, Cambodia fell.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I've read about that, about the CIA. Like,
Yeah.
so they were quite negative
Well,
rumor in Thai. Some, I mean some.
Yes,
Yeah.
no, I think we tend to be very suspicious of, and this was in Thailand, and
Thailand's never been colonized, so why did they let
Yeah.
this happen? Because they wanted support against communism. They were
Mm.
really worried about communism, you know?
Mm.
Sure. Communists were doing quite well in the Northeast.
So did they support monks?
Kirifutopiku.
Kitiwato Piku?
There is a connection there. There was a few monks that were. But I'm not saying you know, we can't take it too far, but you know,
I don't remember
Yeah.
all the details. I think some,
Read
also
Ford-
some
read Ford's
Buddhist
book.
figures who were more progressive in orientation also sometimes receive funding from the Asia Foundation. The Asia Foundation was not exclusively or primarily an organization to fund
Yeah.
to fund Buddhist things. Many of their activities had to do with education, healthcare. They were funding a range of activities in different countries. And they, and their activities at the present time, I believe, in Cambodia and elsewhere are to support NGO type work that will
not so political.
yeah,
Yeah.
which is not so clearly political. The unusual thing is that this particular time, they did make the decision to actively support Buddhist organizations. And Buddhist organizations they believed would provide a defense against communism.
So they support the World Fellowship of Buddhism. They gave money, but then eventually they fell out with Malala Sekara because he went to Russia and to China. You know, it's like, you know, yeah. So these things are complicated, yeah.
But these Asia Foundation type organizations now also, I don't think they're like not political because they're trying to support the liberal ideas in a
They
way.
got in a lot of trouble. And during when the Americans lost the Vietnam War, there was a loss of appetite for this sort of thing throughout Asia. Like everyone's going, no, thank you, we don't really want that.
But
Yeah.
it's complicated. And
Yeah.
even now you can say they're not political in the same way they were then. They're not,
What's political?
they're not linked to the CIA.
They are political.
But for example, they would support NGOs. In some countries, NGOs are encouraged more than in other countries, like the US. Again, maybe it's dangerous to me to make any statements of this kind at all, but like in Cambodia, at a certain point, the US began to decrease its direct aid to the government and instead gave money to NGO organizations, non-governmental organizations. Even that, and some of these non-governmental organizations might have then received funding through the Asia Foundation. And so even this has its own political implications. It has the fact that the US chooses certain projects to support and other projects not to support, and which are not overtly political. They're not supporting political parties. They're supporting aid, and yet some projects may appeal to them more than other projects because of the kinds of projects they value more than maybe another organization would value. So
No, I'm just thinking about the NGOs that support Buddhist nuns. Tell me that's not political. Like when you get a Western organization going into Sri Lanka supporting Buddhist nuns, it's like, ooh.
yeah, I mean, and who
Yeah.
does support in Cambodia, the Heinrich Böll Foundation supported the nuns organization.
Like Sakyadita, or, you know, like those ones that Gihani wrote about, you know.
Because they're all operating in the same paradigm. It's just like a progressive, very market driven paradigm. It's not like
Feminist.
communist driven.
It's like
Yeah,
femi-
feminism is
feminism.
also coming under that also.
Sangha is rolling in its anxiety because of this feminism that's coming in from the West, which doesn't understand traditional Sri Lankan Buddhism or culture.
Are there any more comments or questions from the video participants?
Venerables or
I believe, well, there's Angela, and I believe the other participants are all monks. Yeah.
sit, so on. Sakseret.
Hello. Yeah, I find the discussion is very interesting regarding the Asia Foundation. I think I think you are absolutely right about the current activities. I think they still affiliated with some non-governmental organization in Cambodia, especially some non-governmental organization, also a Buddhist NGO, and because I used to work there before, and there is some interns from the Asia Foundation to work in as an internship in the Cambodia, and they still affiliated, but not. I'm not sure it is the direct link between the Buddhist NGO with the Asia Foundation, but there's still some affiliation between the NGO in Cambodia and the Asia Foundation is still going on, I believe.
Okay, that's interesting too. Yeah.
And that it's not a bad thing.
Yeah.
It just,
Yeah.
I'm not saying it's,
Right. And I tend to think despite the CIA connection, there were some good things that came out of the Asia Foundation support of Cambodian monks going
Indeed, yeah.
India in the 1950s and 1960s.
and Mahagosananda, I mean, it's fascinating. I don't really have, was he nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize or did he get one?
He did not get one. He was nominated. He did win a major Japanese peace prize.
right,
But,
But this is a book by him, but it,
are you on? Shall I hold it up?
yes, please.
and
But he's
let's-
very famous. I don't know if you've heard of him, but at the time when.
Yeah, I read it before. Yeah, it is a very
I think
interesting book.
the Cambodian monks will all have heard of him, and
Yeah, it's quite
still-
famous. I think. Yeah,
he's still
kind of-
not that well known outside of people interested in Cambodia, although
Well,
his-
people do.
his reputation is increasing, I believe.
I think he's second only to Chunat, the supreme patriarch of Cambodia, the Sangaraja of Cambodia. Chunat, I think you also wrote it in his name in the article. But
Yeah.
Mahakosanan, I think he number 2, I believe.
Yeah, maybe number 2, maybe Huat Tat.
That's in the past.
I know it's in the past. You're right. You're
Yeah,
right.
but Mahakosanan is also in the past, but his popularity is still going.
I think, yeah, when
It
I
was- it-
talk to younger monks, I think there is increasing interest in Mahagosananda now.
He is more international if compared to
Yeah,
to Chunat or Huatat in this case.
Of course, he was outside of Cambodia during the Khmer
That's
Rouge
true.
period.
Yeah, that's absolutely
So he
true.
was never disrobed. And he
Yeah.
did a very brave thing by going to the refugee camps and then walking
Indeed.
across land that was held by the Khmer Rouge and sort of taking it back for peace. That
He's-
was a terribly brave thing for him to do.
Indeed, yeah. His story is so quite inspiring and so beautiful as well. I believe. I know a Buddhist monk who used to work with him. His name is Heinrich, and I'm not sure that you heard of his name before, no? But he's
yeah, we
social Buddhist thinker in
know
Cambodia.
Heng Moni Chenda, and of
Yeah,
course,
I used to work with him, and
oh, that's great. That's great.
Yeah.
And of course, Samdat,
he's very close to a Mahakosanan, I think.
yeah, Samdat Yon Sangyet as well, was walked in some of the early
Indeed,
peace walks as well.
yeah.
They call Dhammachai.
Yeah,
Dhammachai.
yeah, Dhammachai.
So it's like they're making a sima, a piece around, just to go back to the sima analogy,
Pardon?
making a sima piece, a boundary around Cambodia, reconsecrating Cambodia for Buddhism.
Well, that's
Does
an
that make
interesting
sense?
idea.
Yeah.
I would like to know if you have,
Somebody said that to me, I didn't make it.
okay, yeah.
But yeah, the Dhammachai was like reconsecrating Cambodia for Buddhism. Yeah, I like that idea. A lot. And they had landmines and people shooting at them, you know, Khmer shooting at them. I mean, it was a big deal. No weapons.
And
Totally
Yeah,
unarmed.
it was a big
I-
deal.
yeah, and I'm old enough that I remember I did not ever, well, on one of the walks, I had friends who were Cambodian monks, and when the people came to Phnom Penh, I joined the walk when they walked around Phnom Penh, but I did not participate in the long walk. But I remember I was in Cambodia at the time of the first walk, and it was a very emotional thing. And we were quite aware of these walks, and it seemed to be very significant at the time. So,
Yeah, I was too young to remember all of that, but
Yes,
I heard from my families and I read some books, and it's quite emotional and then as you said, and inspiring, and so much suffering in that story as well.
okay, well, I think we can end then.
Do you want to give them a heads up about tomorrow?
Well, tomorrow, I'll be talking about 1979 ordinations in Cambodia, which is a controversial topic, and also recently there's been a lot of Facebook activities discussing this whole issue. So there's some new photographs that I'd never seen before that are now in circulation. So so anyway, will be the topic for tomorrow. Some research I did about the 1979 ordination. That is the process where Cambodia returned to the monastic lineage following the period in the Pol Pot period when the monastic lineage was interrupted. So. Okay, well, thank you everyone for your participation, and we'll see people tomorrow.
Thank you.
Okay, I guess I'm the one who has to push the button.